I am Valerie, 32 years old, and at 8 months pregnant, I attended my older brother's lavish engagement party. I watched my father hand the keys to my custom BMW to my brother's new fiancée. When I stepped up to demand my property back, my father grabbed a heavy brass camera tripod and swung it directly at my head. I staggered backward, my pregnant belly slamming into a marble table. As my water broke and blood pooled on the floor, I called my husband. 30 minutes later, a fleet of armored vehicles crashed through the estate gates and everyone froze. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to survive a toxic family. The evening began at my parents' sprawling Buckhead estate in Atlanta. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, glowing light over 50 of the city's most elite real estate moguls and high society figures. I sat alone in a quiet corner of the massive ballroom, resting a protective hand on my swollen stomach. My husband Donovan was running slightly late, delayed by what my family incorrectly assumed was his low-paying corporate job. They had no idea that Donovan was actually the billionaire chief executive officer of Vanguard Private Equity, a massive financial institution. To my parents, I was nothing more than a low-level accounting clerk, the perpetual family scapegoat who never quite measured up to my golden child brother Carlton. In reality, I was a senior forensic liquidator managing ruthless corporate takeovers and quietly amassing a fortune that rivaled my father's own entire real estate portfolio. My father, Harrison, tapped his crystal champagne flute with a solid silver spoon. The bustling room fell silent. He stood very tall in his custom-tailored tuxedo, gesturing grandly toward Carlton and his new fiancée, Paige. Paige stood beside him in an expensive silk designer gown, perfectly playing the role of the innocent white addition to our powerful family. Harrison cleared his throat loudly and announced to the captive audience that he had procured a very special gift to properly welcome Paige into our inner circle. He reached deep into his jacket pocket and pulled out a set of shiny car keys featuring the highly distinct and famous logo of a BMW M8 competition. My breath hitched painfully in my throat. That was my exact personal car. I had purchased that custom limited edition vehicle completely entirely with my own hard-earned money just 2 months prior to this event. I had temporarily parked the luxury car in my parents' enormous and secure climate-controlled garage, only because Donovan and I were currently having our own sprawling estate extensively renovated. Paige eagerly took the keys from his hand, wiping a fake tear of joy from her cheek. She leaned closely into the microphone and delivered a sickly sweet speech to the guests. She thanked my father profusely for his extreme generosity and overwhelming kindness. Then she added a highly specific comment that made my blood boil hot. She stated she was so incredibly grateful to finally have a proper luxury vehicle to drive to her high-end charity galas and upscale networking events. She maliciously noted it was so much better than letting such a beautiful and powerful machine sit around idly, collecting dust, while being completely wasted on mundane grocery runs and exhausting diaper duty. She intentionally looked directly down at my own heavily pregnant belly when she delivered that poisonous line. The affluent and wealthy crowd chuckled politely, completely unaware of the underlying venom. I did not laugh at all. I pushed myself up from my velvet chair aggressively, ignoring the heavy, persistent ache in my lower back, and walked straight up to the raised platform with unwavering purpose. Before Paige could even slowly step down from the stage, I reached out swiftly and snatched the keys right out of her perfectly manicured hand. The entire massive ballroom gasped collectively in pure shock. My mother, Vivian, rushed forward immediately, her face twisting with sudden uncontrolled rage. She grabbed my arm. The phone slipped from my blood-stained fingers, clattering against the pristine marble floor. A sharp, agonizing cramp tore through my lower abdomen, stealing the breath from my lungs. I curled onto my side, clutching my stomach, praying for my baby to hold on. Above me, the crystal chandeliers continued to sparkle, casting a mocking glow over the nightmare unfolding. I looked up, expecting to see panic or remorse in my father's eyes. Instead, Harrison simply adjusted his tuxedo jacket and handed the heavy brass tripod back to the terrified hired photographer. He did not ask if I was alive. He did not reach for his phone to call for an ambulance. My mother, Vivian, rushed forward, but her eyes never even met my face. She looked directly at the expanding pool of dark blood and amniotic fluid spreading across her expensive imported flooring. Her face twisted into a mask of pure panic. She started snapping her fingers wildly, yelling for the catering staff to bring bleach and heavy towels immediately. She screamed that the chairman of the Vanguard Investment Fund was arriving in less than 30 minutes to finalize their massive real estate deal. She actually told the maids to scrub the floor around my body because she refused to let a messy family dispute ruin the most important financial meeting of her entire life. I gasped for air, another brutal contraction ripping through me. "Mom!" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the chatter of the horrified guests who were slowly backing away from the scene. "Please call 911. Vivian ignored me completely, stepping carefully around my legs to avoid ruining her silk gown. Paige walked up right behind her, peering down at me with an expression of intense disgust. She looked at her feet and let out a dramatic, irritated sigh. She whined to Carlton that the dirty water from my dress had splashed onto her brand-new Christian Louboutin heels, completely ruining the red soles. She demanded that Carlton buy her a replacement pair immediately to make up for the trauma I was putting her through. Carlton nodded eagerly, assuring his fiancée that she deserved much better than this chaos. Then his eyes locked onto my phone lying a few feet away. He realized I had just made a call. He lunged forward, snatching the device from the floor. He yelled that I was probably calling my broke husband to come make another pathetic scene and humiliate them further. He raised his foot and stomped his expensive leather shoe down on the screen, shattering the glass into 100 pieces. He kicked the broken pieces under the table, grinning down at me as if he had just won a prize. They were destroying the evidence. They were going to let me lie there and bleed out to protect their social standing and their precious business deal. The physical pain was blinding, but the emotional realization was absolute. These people were not my family. They were monsters who viewed me as entirely subhuman and inconvenience to be swept under the rug. I forced my breathing to slow, channeling every ounce of my remaining strength into my left arm. I slid my hand out of their line of sight and blindly tapped the side button on my smartwatch, holding it down until I felt the rapid haptic vibration confirm the emergency SOS had been silently triggered. 30 agonizing minutes passed. 30 minutes of lying in my own blood, listening to my father assure his elite guests that everything was perfectly fine and that I was simply having a hysterical overreaction. He ordered the string quartet to resume playing classical music to cover the sound of my ragged breathing. Then, the heavy crystal glasses on the tables began to vibrate. A low, deafening rumble echoed from outside, growing louder and more intense by the second. The sound of a heavy military-grade helicopter filled the air, hovering directly over the estate. Before anyone could run to the windows, the sound of crunching metal and shattering brick echoed from the front of the property. Multiple heavy armored vehicles had just driven straight through the locked wrought iron gates of the Buckhead mansion, tearing them off their hinges. The grand mahogany front doors of the estate were thrown open with such force they slammed against the walls. The string quartet stopped playing instantly. The wealthy guests gasped and scattered as a dozen armed tactical security personnel swarmed into the ballroom, forming a secure perimeter. Right behind them walked the county police chief, his hand resting on his radio. And walking dead center through the sea of terrified socialites was Donovan. He was not wearing the casual sweaters my family loved to mock. He was wearing a sharp, tailored midnight blue suit radiating a dark, terrifying aura of absolute authority. My father and brother instantly lit up with greedy excitement. They had never met the elusive Vanguard chairman in person, having only dealt with his representatives. Seeing the massive security detail and the sheer display of wealth and power, Harrison assumed his billionaire savior had finally arrived. He shoved past the remaining guests, smoothing his hair and extending his hand with a wide, fawning smile. Harrison rushed forward, welcoming the chairman to his home, apologizing profusely for the minor mess on the floor, and promising that their business meeting would proceed immediately in his private study. Carlton eagerly followed behind his father, nodding enthusiastically and offering to personally escort the chairman away from the chaos. Donovan did not even look at them. He walked right past my father, leaving Harrison's hand suspended in midair. He moved with terrifying purpose straight toward the pool of blood where I was lying. A private medical team rushed in right behind him, unfolding a stretcher. Donovan dropped to his knees right into the blood and water, ruining his expensive suit. He gently gathered my face in his hands, his eyes filled with a storm of rage and terror that he was fighting to control for my sake. "I am here," he whispered, kissing my forehead, as the paramedics swiftly moved me onto the stretcher. "You are safe now. I have you." Harrison stood frozen in the middle of the room, his outstretched hands slowly dropping to his side. His face turned a sickly shade of gray as he looked from the tactical security team to the police chief, and finally to the man holding his bleeding daughter. "You," he stammered, his voice shaking with sudden, profound realization. "You are the chairman of Vanguard." Donovan stood up slowly. The air in the room seemed to freeze. He turned to face the man who had just nearly killed me. He did not yell. His voice was deathly quiet, carrying a weight that made the entire ballroom hold its breath. "Arrest him for attempted murder," Donovan said, looking directly at the police chief. "And throw every single one of them out onto the street immediately. My fund purchased the deed to this property yesterday. You are all trespassing in my wife's home." Tightly, her sharp acrylic nails digging painfully deep into my sensitive skin. She hissed viciously right under her breath, calling me a jealous, bitter, and completely broke failure who could never stand to see my older brother truly happy. She demanded forcefully that I return the expensive keys to my future sister-in-law immediately, or face severe consequences. I pulled my arm away violently and held up the keys high so everyone in the room could see them clearly. I announced loudly and firmly that this was my personal car, legally purchased with my own private funds, and it was certainly not a free party favor to be casually handed out to a greedy, manipulative gold digger. Harrison stepped aggressively into my personal space, his face turning dark purple with absolute fury. He yelled forcefully that I and my supposedly broke husband did not deserve a vehicle of that incredible caliber. He stated proudly and arrogantly that he had used his powerful connections at the luxury dealership to forge a transfer of the title directly to Carlton. He claimed loudly it was his absolute right as the head of the household to actively reallocate family resources to the only son who actually brought real prestige and value to our family name. He ordered me to stop embarrassing myself immediately and leave his private property. I looked at the exact people who were supposed to love and protect me unconditionally. I saw nothing but raw greed, blinding arrogance, and pure entitlement staring back at me. I pulled my phone from my designer clutch, quickly opened my digital vehicle management application, and pressed the bright red panic button. Outside in the pristine courtyard, the deafening, piercing shriek of the BMW security alarm erupted, completely destroying the elegant, refined atmosphere of the party and drowning out my father's completely ridiculous, angry demands. The phone slipped from my blood-stained fingers, clattering against the pristine marble floor. A sharp, agonizing cramp tore through my lower abdomen, stealing the breath from my lungs. I curled onto my side, clutching my stomach, praying for my baby to hold on. Above me, the crystal chandeliers continued to sparkle, casting a mocking glow over the nightmare unfolding. I looked up, expecting to see panic or remorse in my father's eyes. Instead, Harrison simply adjusted his tuxedo jacket and handed the heavy brass tripod back to the terrified hired photographer. He did not ask if I was alive. He did not reach for his phone to call for an ambulance. He just stared down at me with an expression of absolute cold indifference, as if I were nothing more than a minor nuisance that had interrupted his perfect evening. My mother, Vivian, rushed forward, but her eyes never even met my face. She looked directly at the expanding pool of dark blood and amniotic fluid spreading across her expensive imported flooring. Her face twisted into a mask of pure panic. She started snapping her fingers wildly, yelling for the catering staff to bring bleach and heavy towels immediately. She screamed that the chairman of the Vanguard Investment Fund was arriving in less than 30 minutes to finalize their massive real estate deal. She actually told the maids to scrub the floor around my body because she refused to let a messy family dispute ruin the most important financial meeting of her entire life. I gasped for air, another brutal contraction ripping through me. "Mom," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the chatter of the horrified guests who were slowly backing away from the scene. "Please call an ambulance." Vivian ignored me completely, stepping carefully around my legs to avoid ruining her silk gown. Paige walked up right behind her, peering down at me with an expression of intense disgust. She looked at her feet and let out a dramatic, irritated sigh. She whined to Carlton that the dirty water from my dress had splashed onto her brand new designer heels, completely ruining the red soles. She demanded that Carlton buy her a replacement pair immediately to make up for the trauma I was putting her through by bleeding on the floor. Carlton nodded eagerly, assuring his fiancée that she deserved much better than this chaos. Then his eyes locked onto my phone lying a few feet away. He realized I had just made a call. He lunged forward, snatching the device from the puddle of water. He yelled that I was probably calling my broke husband to come make another pathetic scene and humiliate them further in front of their wealthy friends. Without hesitation, he raised his heavy dress shoe and brought his heel down on the screen. He stomped on it again and again until the glass shattered into 100 pieces and the device went completely dark. He kicked the broken pieces under a nearby table, grinning down at me as if he had just won a prize. They were destroying the evidence. They were going to let me lie there and bleed out to protect their social standing and their precious business deal. The physical pain was blinding, but the emotional realization was absolute. These people were not my family. They were monsters who viewed me as entirely subhuman, an inconvenience to be swept under the rug. I was fighting for my life and the life of my unborn child, while they complained about shoes and business meetings. I forced my breathing to slow down, channeling every ounce of my remaining focus into my left arm. My phone was destroyed, but they had forgotten about the smartwatch strapped to my wrist. Under the cover of my body, I blindly pressed the side button, holding it down until I felt the rapid haptic vibration confirm that the emergency sequence had been silently triggered. My location and a distress signal were transmitted directly to Donovan's private security network and local emergency services. Then the waiting began. It was the longest 30 minutes of my entire existence, 30 agonizing minutes of lying in my own blood, listening to my father assure his elite guests that everything was perfectly fine and that I was simply having a hysterical overreaction to a minor fall. He ordered the string quartet to resume playing classical music to cover the sound of my ragged breathing and soft cries of pain. The freezing temperature of the marble floor seeped deep into my bones, making my entire body shiver uncontrollably. The remaining party guests were ushered out into the garden away from the gruesome scene. The maids brought thick white towels and began wiping the floor mere inches from my face, treating me like a piece of broken furniture they had to clean around. My mother stood by the grand staircase, adjusting her diamond jewelry and checking her reflection in a large mirror. She told my father to straighten his tie because the billionaire investor would be walking through those doors any second, and they needed to project absolute perfection and confidence. The pain was becoming unbearable. My vision was blurring at the edges as I lost more blood. I closed my eyes, praying for my baby to hold on just a little bit longer. I promised my child that we would survive this and that these people would pay for what they had done. Suddenly, the heavy crystal glasses on the catering tables began to vibrate. A low, deafening roar echoed from outside, growing louder and more intense by the fraction of a second. The unmistakable sound of heavy helicopter blades filled the air, hovering directly over the estate. The rhythmic beating was so powerful, it shook the entire mansion. Before my parents could even turn toward the windows, the sound of crunching metal and shattering brick exploded from the front of the property. A massive fleet of black armored sport utility vehicles had just driven straight through the locked wrought iron gates of the Buckhead estate, tearing the heavy steel completely off its hinges. The heavy steel gates crumpled like tinfoil beneath the weight of the massive black vehicles. The screech of expensive tires on the pristine cobblestone driveway cut through the classical music still playing awkwardly in the background. Dozens of highly trained tactical security officers poured out of the vehicles before they had even fully come to a stop. They moved with terrifying precision, forming a solid, impenetrable wall around the perimeter of the ballroom and completely blocking every single exit. The wealthy socialites who had been enjoying their champagne just moments before were now backed against the walls, murmuring in pure panic. My mother, Vivian, dropped the bloody towels she had been holding, her perfectly lifted face frozen in a mask of absolute horror. She frantically tried to kick the blood-soaked rags under the marble console table, desperate to hide the gruesome scene from whoever was arriving. My father Harrison, however, experienced a completely different reaction. He looked past the armed guards and saw the sleek, custom-armored sport utility vehicle idling at the front of the convoy. In his greed-blinded mind, there was only one logical explanation for this level of extreme security and display of absolute power. The elusive chairman of the Vanguard Investment Fund had finally arrived to finalize their massive real estate merger. Harrison completely forgot about the fact that he had just struck his pregnant daughter with a heavy brass tripod. He forgot about my broken, bleeding body lying agonizingly on his expensive marble floor. He immediately grabbed his tuxedo lapels, giving them a sharp tug to straighten his jacket. He turned to Carlton and fiercely whispered an order, commanding his son to get Paige out of the way and prepare the financial portfolios immediately. Carlton nodded eagerly, his eyes wide with the promise of billions of dollars. He practically shoved his weeping fiancée behind a decorative pillar and scrambled to stand at our father's right-hand side. Together, they literally stepped directly over the expanding pool of my blood, carefully avoiding ruining their polished leather shoes. They marched toward the grand entrance with their chests puffed out, pasting on their most charming sycophantic smiles, ready to grovel for the deal of a lifetime. The heavy passenger door of the lead vehicle swung open. The county police chief stepped out first, his hand resting firmly on his duty belt, his expression grim as he surveyed the chaotic scene. But it was the man who stepped out next who made the entire ballroom hold its collective breath. It was Donovan. He was not wearing the casual, comfortable sweaters my elitist family constantly mocked him for. He was wearing a sharply tailored midnight blue suit that radiated an aura of ruthless, unyielding authority. He did not look like the quiet, patient husband who endured my parents' endless passive-aggressive insults at Thanksgiving dinners. He looked exactly like what he truly was, a titan of industry, a billionaire who could dismantle entire corporations with a single phone call. Harrison did not recognize him at first. My father was so entirely blinded by his own narcissism and greed that he only saw the wealth radiating from the man approaching his doors. Harrison rushed forward, his hand extended enthusiastically, his fake smile stretched so wide it looked painful. He welcomed the chairman to his home, his voice booming with false warmth. He deeply apologized for the dramatic entrance and the minor mess on the floor inside, claiming they had a slight family dispute, but assuring him it had been handled. He begged the man to come into his private study, promising that the Vanguard contracts were ready for his signature and that this partnership would be the most lucrative decision of his career. Carlton chimed in right behind him, nodding furiously and stating it was an absolute honor to finally meet him. He offered to personally escort the chairman away from the unfortunate chaos. Donovan did not slow his pace. He did not blink. He did not even look at my father or my brother. He walked straight past them with such cold, dismissive force that the sheer momentum seemed to knock Harrison slightly off balance. He left my father's hand hanging pathetically in midair, completely ignored. Donovan only had eyes for me. The cold, ruthless armor of the billionaire chief executive vanished the absolute second his gaze locked onto my pale face. A private medical team had followed him out of the vehicles, quickly unfolding a portable stretcher and rushing into the ballroom. Donovan sprinted the last few yards, dropping straight down onto his knees, right into the center of the massive puddle of blood and amniotic fluid. He did not care that the dark red liquid was immediately soaking into his expensive trousers. He gently gathered my face in his large, warm hands, his blue eyes wild with a mixture of absolute terror and a rage so deep it made the air around him feel heavy. He whispered that he was here, his voice cracking as he leaned down and pressed a desperate kiss to my cold forehead. He told me I was safe now, and that the paramedics were going to take care of me and our baby. He begged me to just keep looking at him. I let out a ragged, breathless sob, the pain in my abdomen momentarily eclipsed by the overwhelming relief of his presence. I clung to his jacket, leaving a bloody handprint against the expensive fabric, while the medical team swiftly moved in, placing an oxygen mask over my face and assessing my vital signs. Behind Donovan, the silence in the room was deafening. Harrison stood entirely frozen near the entryway, his arms still awkwardly raised. He slowly turned his head, his eyes darting from the police chief to the tactical guards, and finally landing on the man holding me on the floor. The gears in his arrogant mind were grinding together, struggling to comprehend the impossible reality unfolding in front of him. He stammered, asking how this was possible, his voice stripped of all its previous booming confidence, leaving only a weak, pathetic croak. He pointed a trembling finger at my husband, asking if he was the broke accountant, and realizing out loud that he was actually the Vanguard chairman. Vivian let out a strangled gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. Carlton physically stumbled backward, bumping heavily into a tray of champagne glasses that crashed loudly onto the floor. Paige peeked out from behind the pillar, her face draining of all color, as she realized the man whose wife she had just mocked owned half the city. Donovan slowly stood up. The tender, loving husband who had just been comforting me disappeared completely, instantly, replaced by the man who destroyed financial empires before breakfast. He stood tall, stepping protectively in front of my stretcher, as the paramedics secured me for transport. Donovan did not look at my mother or my brother. He turned his head slowly, locking his freezing, ruthless stare directly onto my father. He looked at the police chief standing firmly by his side. "Arrest him for attempted murder," Donovan stated, his voice deathly quiet but echoing through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. "And throw the rest of them out on the street immediately. My fund purchased the deed to this property yesterday. You are all trespassing in my wife's home." I remember the flashing lights of the ambulance reflecting off the wet pavement as we sped away from the estate. The frantic shouting of the medical team is a blur in my memory. When I finally forced my heavy eyelids open, the harsh fluorescent lights of the recovery room blinded me. A sharp, agonizing pain radiated through my completely numb lower half. I tried to speak, but my throat was painfully dry. I turned my head and saw Donovan sitting in a sterile plastic chair beside my bed. His midnight blue suit was permanently stained with my blood. His tie was gone, and the top buttons of his shirt were ripped open. He looked as though he had aged 10 years in the span of a few hours. He saw my eyes open and immediately leaned forward, gripping my hand like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. I asked him where our baby was. My voice was raspy and weak, barely a whisper in the quiet room. Donovan swallowed hard, his jaw clenching as a single tear escaped his eye. He explained that the doctors had to perform a highly traumatic emergency C-section to save both of our lives. Our son was alive, but he was born far too early. The severe physical trauma from the impact had caused a massive placental abruption. Our little boy was currently fighting for his life in the neonatal intensive care unit. He was suffering from severe respiratory distress, and his tiny lungs were not fully developed. He was hooked up to a dozen different machines breathing for him through tiny plastic tubes. The thought of my fragile son fighting for every single breath inside a cold plastic incubator felt like a physical blow to my chest. It was a miracle he survived the strike at all. Donovan kissed the back of my bruised hand. His expression shifted from profound grief to a terrifying, unyielding rage. He swore to me right then and there that he would tear the entire city of Atlanta apart, piece by piece, to make my family pay for what they had done. He promised he would spend every last dime of his massive personal fortune to ensure Harrison spent the rest of his miserable life rotting inside a concrete cell. He told me he had already dispatched his elite legal team to freeze all of my father's personal accounts, and that the local police were processing the attempted murder charges as we spoke. He was prepared to unleash absolute hell upon my family for daring to touch his wife and child. I looked at the man who loved me enough to burn the world down for my sake. I closed my eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath, pushing past the excruciating physical agony burning through my fresh surgical stitches. A strange, chilling calm washed over my entire body. I did not cry. I did not panic. I did not mourn the family I had finally lost because they were never truly mine to begin with. I opened my eyes and looked directly at Donovan. I told him not to call his lawyers just yet. I told him to reach into his leather briefcase and hand me my secure work laptop. Donovan looked confused for a fraction of a second before a dark, knowing smile spread across his exhausted face. He understood exactly what I was about to do. He reached down and placed the heavy silver laptop gently over my lap, making sure it did not press against my wounded abdomen. The physical battle back at the estate was completely over, but the financial slaughter was just beginning. For the past 4 years, my father truly believed I was nothing but a low-level clerk pushing papers at a boring accounting firm. He had no idea that I spent my days quietly purchasing the distressed debt of his highly leveraged commercial properties through dozens of anonymous shell companies. Harrison had built his entire real estate empire on a foundation of massive, fragile loans, and I owned almost every single one of them. My fingers flew across the keyboard, ignoring the steady, rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor. I logged into my highly secure corporate terminal and began executing the lethal clauses we had baked into his loans. I triggered the immediate call provisions on his 3 largest commercial properties. I initiated a ruthless, hostile takeover of his primary holding company, pulling the financial rug completely out from under his arrogant feet. I watched the screen as the automated banking systems began freezing his corporate assets, liquidating his real estate portfolios, and transferring ownership of his most prized downtown developments directly to my liquidation firm. Within 15 minutes, I had systematically dismantled decades of his ruthless corporate greed. I was wiping out his entire net worth, erasing his legacy, while lying in a hospital bed recovering from his violent assault. I was just preparing to initiate the final sequence that would legally lock him out of his remaining offshore accounts when a loud, chaotic commotion erupted in the hallway outside my room. I heard the sharp sound of a nurse yelling a frantic protest, followed by the heavy thud of someone shoving a body against a wall. Before Donovan could even stand up to investigate, the heavy wooden door to my hospital room burst open with violent force. My mother Vivian and my future sister-in-law Paige stormed into the sterile room. They had somehow managed to bribe or completely bypass the hospital's security staff downstairs. Vivian was practically foaming at the mouth, her perfectly styled designer hair in complete disarray. She was clutching a thick stack of legal documents and a pen in her trembling hands. She marched straight toward my hospital bed, entirely ignoring the monitors and intravenous lines attached to my arms. She did not ask about her grandson in the intensive care unit. She did not ask if I was going to survive. She shoved the papers directly into my face and demanded forcefully that I sign a comprehensive liability waiver immediately to protect her husband from going to prison. The sharp edge of the thick legal document actually scraped against my cheek as Vivian thrust it toward me, her diamond rings flashing under the harsh hospital lights. "Sign it right now, Valerie." She hissed, her voice vibrating with a frantic, manic energy that completely ignored the heart monitors beeping wildly beside my bed. She did not ask if my son was breathing. She did not ask how many pints of blood they had to pump into my veins to keep my heart beating after my own father used a brass tripod to crush my abdomen. All she cared about was the Vanguard merger and the fact that the Atlanta Police Department currently had her precious billionaire husband sitting in an interrogation room facing charges of attempted murder. Donovan moved so fast he was a blur of dark blue wool and barely contained violence. He stepped between me and my mother, snatching the papers out of her hand and shoving her backward with enough force that she stumbled into the heavy wooden door. He told her if she ever came within 10 feet of me again, he would personally ensure she never saw the outside of a prison cell. Vivian just scoffed, straightening her ruined designer jacket and looking at Donovan like he was nothing more than an annoying insect buzzing around her perfect world. She told him to back off because this was family business and he was just collateral damage. That was when Paige stepped out from the hallway, shadows stepping into the sterile hospital room with a smug, calculated smirk painted across her face. She clicked her brand new designer heels against the linoleum floor, holding a sleek leather briefcase against her chest. She looked at my pale, bruised face and let out a dramatic little sigh, shaking her head as if I were a disobedient child who had just thrown a tantrum. "We both know you are going to sign that waiver," Valerie Page said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Because if you do not tell the police that this was all just a terrible, clumsy accident, you are going to lose a lot more than just your dignity." I forced myself to sit up higher against the pillows, the fresh surgical incision across my stomach burning like hot coals. I asked her what she was talking about, my voice rasping in the quiet room. Paige casually unclasped her briefcase and pulled out a stack of financial documents heavily redacted with black ink, but bearing one unmistakable detail at the bottom of every single page. My signature. Except I had never signed them. Paige smiled, walking closer to the foot of my bed. "5 years ago," she explained smoothly, "when you were fresh out of college and too stupid to read the documents your father put in front of you. He set up 6 different offshore shell companies strictly in your name. He funneled over $40 million of untaxed revenue straight through those accounts. You are the sole managing director, Valerie. Every single illegal tax evasion scheme, every fraudulent wire transfer, it all points directly back to you." The reality of her words settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. 5 years ago, I had trusted my father when he told me he was setting up a modest trust fund for my future. He had handed me a stack of papers and told me where to sign, claiming it was just standard legal boilerplate to secure my financial independence. I had been so eager to please him, so desperate for his approval, that I signed my name without reading a single paragraph. They had framed me. My own family had deliberately set me up as the perfect sacrificial lamb, ready to take the fall if the Internal Revenue Service ever came knocking at their door. "If you testify against Harrison," Paige continued, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper, "I will personally hand-walk these files straight to the federal authorities. The IRS will freeze every asset you have. You will be indicted for massive corporate fraud and tax evasion. You will go to federal prison for a very long time, Valerie." She paused, letting her eyes flick toward the hallway where the neonatal intensive care unit was located. "And that premature little baby boy you just bled all over the floor for, he will become a ward of the state. He will go straight into the foster care system and you will never see him again." Vivian nodded in agreement, stepping out from behind Donovan to glare down at me with absolute disgust. "You have always been so incredibly selfish, Valerie," my mother snarled, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure resentment. "You never think about the family legacy. You only ever care about your own pathetic little life. Sign the waiver right now, drop the charges, and the family will graciously grant you a 1% share of the company. That is more money than you or this broke husband of yours will ever see in your entire miserable lives. Just sign the paper and we will make this all go away." The sheer audacity of their extortion hung heavy in the sterile hospital air. My mother and my future sister-in-law were standing in the room where I was fighting to recover from a brutal assault, threatening to throw me in a federal penitentiary and send my fragile newborn son to an orphanage, all to protect the man who had nearly killed us both. They thought they had me backed into a corner. They thought the threat of the IRS and losing my child would terrify me into returning to my role as the silent, obedient victim. They thought I was still the same desperate 22-year-old girl who signed those papers 5 years ago just hoping her daddy would finally look at her with pride. I slowly reached out my hand, extending my trembling fingers toward the liability waiver that Donovan had tossed onto the rolling medical tray. Vivian's eyes immediately lit up with greedy triumph. She pulled a gold fountain pen from her purse and practically shoved it into my palm, eagerly leaning over the bed to point at the dotted line at the bottom of the page. She actually told me to press down hard because they needed the carbon copies to be clear for the police chief. I did not take the pen. Instead, I picked up the thick stack of legal papers, gripping the binding with both hands. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, holding her impatient, demanding stare. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I ripped the entire stack of papers completely in half. The sharp sound of tearing paper echoed loudly in the quiet room. Vivian gasped, stumbling backward as if I had physically struck her. Paige's smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by genuine shock. I let the torn pieces of the waiver fall like snow onto the pristine white hospital blankets. I leaned forward, ignoring the agonizing fire in my abdomen, and smiled a cold, terrifying smile. Vivian stared at the torn pieces of paper resting on my lap, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She looked from the shredded documents to my face, completely incapable of processing that the daughter she had controlled for her entire life had just openly defied her. Paige took a threatening step forward, her designer heels clicking sharply against the floor. She demanded to know what I thought I was doing, warning me that I had just signed my own death warrant. She sneered that I was too stupid to understand the legal trouble I was in and that they were going to let me rot in a federal prison while my baby was handed over to strangers. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The absolute certainty in my chest gave me all the power I needed. I reached for the heavy silver laptop resting beside me and slowly turned the screen so it faced the two women standing at the foot of my bed. I told Paige that she was right about one thing. 5 years ago, I was a naive 22-year-old girl who desperately wanted her father's approval. I had signed those papers because I believed family protected each other. But I told her that I grew up and I got smart. I looked directly into my mother's eyes and explained that I was never a low-level accounting clerk pushing boring paperwork in a gray cubicle. I was a senior forensic liquidator for one of the most ruthless financial oversight firms in the country. Vivian's face drained of all color as she stared at the complex data matrices and legal filings illuminating the screen. I explained exactly what my job entailed. My entire career was built on tracking hidden assets, dismantling fraudulent corporate structures, and destroying the exact type of offshore shell companies my father had tried to hide behind my name. I told them that I had discovered the fraudulent accounts 3 years ago during a routine background check for my security clearance. Instead of panicking or running to my father for an explanation, I had decided to keep my mouth shut and do what I did best. I had spent the last 36 months quietly mapping out every single illegal wire transfer, every dummy corporation, and every forged signature they had ever authorized under my identity. Paige started shaking her head, her arrogant smirk completely vanishing. She weakly tried to claim that I was bluffing, saying there was no way I could have accessed those heavily encrypted files without triggering their internal security alerts. I smiled, leaning back against the pillows as a sharp spike of pain shot through my surgical incision. I told Paige she vastly underestimated the resources at my disposal and vastly overestimated her own intelligence. I had watched them parade around in their designer clothes, paid for by the very fraud they planned to pin on me. I tapped a few keys on the keyboard, pulling up a specific folder labeled with Carlton's name. I reminded them about my custom luxury car, the dark blue BMW that had mysteriously vanished from the estate driveway last month. They had claimed it was stolen by local thieves and laughed in my face when I filed a police report. What they did not know was that the vehicle was equipped with an advanced internal dashcam and highly sensitive audio recording system that automatically uploaded all data to a secure cloud server. I pressed the spacebar on my laptop, and a crisp, clear audio recording began to play loudly in the quiet hospital room. The sound of the car's engine humming in the background was unmistakable. Carlton's voice echoed through the speakers, nervous but deeply greedy. He was complaining about my father holding tightly onto the company purse strings and treating him like a child. Then Paige's voice chimed in sharp and intensely manipulative. She was telling Carlton exactly how to bypass the corporate security protocols to access Harrison's massive employee pension fund. My mother let out a strangled gasp, physically grabbing the edge of the hospital bed to keep herself from collapsing onto the floor. The recording continued playing, revealing the full, terrifying extent of their disgusting betrayal. Paige was outlining a highly detailed plan to embezzle over $80 million from the family pension accounts, funnel the money through the very shell companies they had pinned on me, and flee the country to a non-extradition territory, before my father even realized the money was gone. They were not just setting me up to take the fall for the tax evasion, they were planning to steal my father's entire retirement fortune and leave him completely bankrupt, facing the wrath of hundreds of ruined employees. The recording captured Paige laughing a cold, calculating laugh as she told Carlton that his parents deserved to lose everything for being so blind. Paige was hyperventilating now, her perfectly manicured hands gripping her leather briefcase so hard her knuckles turned stark white. She lunged forward desperately, trying to grab the laptop and smash it against the floor to destroy the audio file. Donovan stepped in front of her like a massive brick wall, his sheer size and intimidating presence forcing her to stumble backward in pure terror. He warned her in a low, dangerous growl that if she took one more step toward my bed, he would break her wrists. Vivian was weeping openly now, the reality of her precious son's ultimate betrayal, shattering her perfect illusion of absolute family loyalty. She realized that while she had been protecting the men in the family, they had been actively plotting to destroy her. I looked at the two women who had tormented me for years, who had stood by while my father nearly killed my unborn child to protect a real estate deal. They were shaking, terrified, and completely powerless before me. I placed my index finger hovering directly over the enter key on my laptop keyboard. I told them that I had compiled every single piece of evidence into a massive digital dossier. The fraudulent tax returns, the forged signatures, the audio recordings of the embezzlement plot, and the offshore bank routing numbers were all perfectly organized. It was all packaged meticulously and ready to go. Vivian fell to her knees, her expensive silk skirt pooling on the sterile linoleum floor, begging me to stop crying, that this would destroy the family name and ruin their lives forever. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, hollow emptiness where my love for her used to reside. She had chosen greed and status over my life and the life of my son. I pressed the enter key with a satisfying final click. The screen flashed bright green, confirming that the encrypted files had been successfully transmitted across multiple secure networks. I looked into my mother's terrified, weeping eyes, watching the devastation finally wash over her perfectly lifted face. I told her, "The IRS will not be looking for me, Mom. They are on their way to your front door right now." The color drained entirely from Vivian's face, leaving her looking like a hollowed-out mannequin. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out at all. She just stared at the glowing green confirmation screen on my laptop, finally realizing that decades of carefully hoarded wealth and stolen pension funds were currently being seized by federal agents. Before she could even sink completely to the floor, the heavy hospital room doors crashed open for a second time. It was Carlton. My brother looked absolutely deranged. His custom-tailored tuxedo was severely wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. He was clutching his phone in one hand and a stack of titanium black cards in the other, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He shoved past a stunned nurse in the hallway, yelling at the top of his lungs that every single one of his accounts had just been declined. Carlton was completely unhinged, his voice cracking as he frantically explained the nightmare he had just experienced. He screamed that he had just tried to charter a private jet to the Cayman Islands to escape the fallout at the estate. But the elite aviation company told him his routing numbers were frozen by federal mandate. His eyes darted frantically around the room, bouncing from Vivian's crumpled weeping form on the floor to Paige's terrified pale face, and finally landing on me, sitting in the hospital bed with my laptop. It took his greedy, self-absorbed brain exactly 3 seconds to process the scene. He saw Donovan standing there looking like an untouchable king, and he saw the financial liquidation terminal open on my screen. Carlton lost his mind entirely. The thin veneer of the polished corporate vice president completely evaporated, leaving behind a violent, desperate coward who realized he was about to lose everything. He began screaming unimaginable insults at me, his face turning a dark shade of purple as he blamed me for ruining his life and stealing what rightfully belonged to him. He completely ignored the fact that I was recovering from a brutal emergency surgery that had been required to save his nephew's life. He ignored the blood and the machines and the pale fragility of my state. With a feral, desperate roar, Carlton lunged toward the hospital bed, raising his fists, intending to wrap his hands around my throat and physically tear the laptop away from me. He wanted to destroy the machine, thinking that would somehow stop the federal agents from seizing his stolen money. He never even made it within 3 feet of my mattress. Donovan did not even have to raise a finger or move a muscle to protect me. The two massive tactical security contractors who had followed Donovan into the hospital moved with terrifying, blinding speed. Before Carlton could even register what was happening, one of the guards grabbed his outstretched arm and twisted it violently behind his back. A loud, sickening pop echoed through the quiet room, followed instantly by Carlton's high-pitched, agonized scream. The guards slammed him face first into the cold, sterile linoleum floor, pinning him completely under their heavy, tactical boots. They pressed a knee firmly between his shoulder blades, grinding his face into the ground, while his precious black credit cards scattered across the floor like worthless pieces of plastic. Carlton was sobbing uncontrollably, now pleading for mercy and whining pathetically that his shoulder was dislocated. He looked absolutely wretched, writhing in his ruined tuxedo, crying for our mother to help him. But Vivian was too paralyzed by her own impending federal indictment to even move a muscle. I looked over at Paige, fully expecting her to rush to her fiancé's side to comfort him. I expected her to scream at the guards to let him go or to cry out of concern for the man she was supposedly going to marry in less than a month. Instead, Paige just stood perfectly still near the doorway, staring down at the blubbering mess of a man pinned to the floor. You could practically see the greedy, desperate calculations running through her head. She looked at the frozen black cards scattered on the ground. She looked at Vivian, trembling and weeping about the IRS. She looked at Donovan, who radiated unimaginable wealth and unyielding power. And in that exact moment, Paige realized the gravy train was officially derailed. The money was completely gone, the leverage was destroyed, and the only thing waiting for the Vanguard heirs was a long federal prison sentence. The mask of the loving, supportive fiancé fell off instantly, revealing the parasitic gold digger underneath. Paige let out a loud, disgusted scoff, crossing her arms over her chest. She reached down and grabbed her left hand, violently twisting the massive 5-carat diamond engagement ring off her finger. She looked down at Carlton, who was still whimpering on the floor, and threw the heavy ring directly at his head. It bounced off his cheek and rolled under the medical cart. Paige stared at him with absolute dripping contempt. She cursed him out, calling him a broke, pathetic loser who could not even protect his own bank accounts. She loudly announced that she was not about to spend the best years of her youth visiting a penniless criminal through a pane of reinforced glass. She told Carlton he was an absolute fool for thinking she actually loved him, and that the only thing attractive about his entire family was their massive bank accounts, which were now completely empty. She told him that he was nothing without his father's money. And now that the money was gone, he was just a sad, weak little boy playing dress-up in a corporate suit. Vivian gasped, clutching her chest and crying out, asking how Paige could betray them like this in their darkest hour. Paige just laughed, a cold, sharp sound that cut right through my mother's fake tears. She sneered at Vivian, telling her that her entire legacy was a joke and that she would probably look terrible in a prison jumpsuit. She told Vivian to save the drama for the federal judge because she was washing her hands of this sinking ship today. Without another word, Paige turned on her designer heels and marched out of the hospital room, her head held high as if she had just won a prize. The guards kept Carlton pinned to the floor, waiting for the local police to arrive and officially take him into custody for the embezzlement plot we had just exposed. Donovan leaned down and softly kissed my forehead, his hand gently brushing a stray lock of hair from my face. He whispered that he needed to step into the hallway for just a minute to coordinate with the hospital administration about moving our baby to the most secure private wing in the building. I nodded, feeling a deep wave of exhaustion washing over me as the adrenaline slowly began to recede. Donovan stepped out of the room, quietly pulling the heavy door closed behind him to shield me from the noise. He did not even make it 5 steps down the corridor before Paige stepped out from the shadows of the waiting area. She had not left the hospital at all. She had been waiting for him. She intercepted my husband stepping directly into his path to block his way to the elevators. She deliberately unbuttoned the top button of her silk blouse and leaned against the wall, batting her eyelashes with sickening desperation. She looked up at the billionaire chairman, calculating her next move to ensure her own survival. Paige smiled a slow, seductive smile and offered him a trade. She told Donovan she knew exactly where Harrison kept the hidden physical ledgers and the offshore access codes. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, offering to trade even more devastating family secrets in exchange for his personal financial protection. Donovan stood perfectly still in the sterile hallway, looking down at the woman who had just plotted to steal millions from her own fiancé. Paige took another step closer to him, completely ignoring the fact that his wife was lying in a hospital bed less than 20 feet away. She ran her perfectly manicured fingers along the lapel of his midnight blue suit, looking up at him through her thick, false eyelashes. She dropped her voice to a breathy whisper, telling him that she knew a powerful man like him needed someone who truly understood how to serve his needs. She practically pressed her body against his chest, offering to give him absolutely everything Harrison had hidden, including the offshore routing numbers and the physical ledgers. All Donovan had to do was promise to set her up in a luxury penthouse and keep her bank accounts full. She let out a dark, soft laugh, telling him she was far more useful and far more entertaining than a broken woman recovering in a hospital bed. Donovan did not blink. He did not step back or push her away. Instead, he slowly reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out his phone. The screen was brightly lit, displaying an active audio recording application that had been capturing every single desperate, greedy word she had just spoken. Paige's seductive smile froze instantly. She stumbled backward, her hands flying up to clutch the unbuttoned collar of her silk blouse, as panic finally flooded her eyes. Donovan looked at her with an expression of pure, icy disgust. He told her she was not nearly as clever or as charming as she thought she was. Then he let out a sharp, piercing whistle that echoed loudly down the empty hospital corridor. The heavy double doors at the far end of the hallway swung open instantly. 2 federal agents wearing dark suits and stern expressions marched directly toward them, their eyes locked entirely on Paige. Donovan tucked his phone away and casually adjusted his lapel, stepping out of their path. He looked right through Paige as he calmly explained that my elite forensic team had not just been investigating Harrison's real estate fraud. They had also run a full comprehensive background check on the mysterious, beautiful woman who had suddenly attached herself to the arrogant Vanguard family heir. Donovan watched her face drain of color as he revealed that we knew exactly who she really was. She was not a wealthy socialite. She was not a successful business consultant. She was a professional marriage fraudster and a highly skilled con artist who was currently wanted in 3 different states. Her entire career consisted of targeting wealthy, vulnerable Black men, isolating them from their families, draining their corporate accounts, and vanishing without a trace before the wedding bells ever rang. Carlton was never her true love. He was just her latest easy mark, a pathetic, arrogant stepping stone to a massive 8-figure payday before she planned to skip the country. The federal agents reached Paige before she could even turn around to run. One of the agents firmly grabbed her arm, spinning her around and shoving her face first against the cold cinderblock wall. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing down the corridor was the sweetest sound. Paige began screaming wildly, thrashing against the agents, and completely losing her carefully crafted, sophisticated persona. She shrieked obscenities, spitting and cursing, as the agents read her rights, informing her of the multiple federal wire fraud and grand larceny warrants waiting for her across state lines. The commotion in the hallway was so loud that the tactical guards holding Carlton inside my hospital room hauled him up to his feet. They dragged him out into the corridor just in time to witness the entire spectacle. Carlton stood there, his dislocated shoulder hanging limply at his side, his expensive custom tuxedo ruined, staring in absolute devastation. He watched the woman he was supposed to marry, the woman he had just betrayed his own parents for, being paraded down the hallway in federal chains. His jaw dropped open as he listened to the agents recite her long list of aliases and previous victims. He finally realized that he had destroyed his entire life, his massive inheritance and his family for a woman who had been literally playing him for an absolute fool from the very first day they met. Harrison stepped out of the heavy glass doors of the Atlanta police precinct into the suffocating humidity of the midnight air. The harsh streetlights illuminated the deep lines of pure, unadulterated rage etched into his aging face. Posting bail had just wiped out his absolute last remaining personal emergency fund, a secret offshore account he had kept hidden even from his wife Vivian for decades. He shoved his way past a group of lingering news reporters, ignoring their flashing camera lenses and their shouted accusations about corporate fraud and attempted murder. He climbed into the back of his waiting armored town car, slamming the heavy door so hard the entire chassis shook. His mobile phone was practically melting in his hand, vibrating continuously with frantic, panicked text messages from his terrified board of directors. Federal agents were currently tearing his pristine corporate headquarters apart, stripping the hard drives from the walls, and seizing decades of highly classified financial records. His entire carefully constructed real estate empire was bleeding out in real time, all because of the ungrateful little girl he had foolishly kept around as a scapegoat. He ordered his driver to bypass their massive estate, knowing the Internal Revenue Service agents were likely already swarming the manicured lawns and confiscating the luxury vehicles. He poured himself a massive glass of scotch from the car's hidden minibar, his hands trembling with a violent mixture of fear and absolute venomous hatred. He swallowed the amber liquid, letting the harsh burn ground him as the car sped through the dark city streets. He cursed Valerie with every breath, taking a solemn vow in the back of that car to tear her entire life down to the bedrock the very second he secured his escape funds. He muttered to himself about how he had fed her, clothed her, and tolerated her mediocre existence for years, while she quietly plotted a massive betrayal behind his back. He felt absolutely no remorse for swinging that heavy brass tripod at her earlier that day. His only regret was that he had not hit her hard enough to silence her permanently. He swore that once he was safely on a private jet bound for a non-extradition country, he would hire the most ruthless fixers money could buy to make her existence a living hell. He would ensure she and that brute husband of hers spent the rest of their miserable days looking over their shoulders in constant fear. But first he needed liquid cash, and he needed it before the federal judges ordered a total freeze on his commercial properties by sunrise. He directed the car to an exclusive underground cigar lounge hidden deep beneath the financial district. This was neutral territory, a place where the city's most ruthless power brokers made dirty deals in the dark, away from the prying eyes of the federal government. Harrison hurried down the dimly lit mahogany staircase, his expensive leather shoes scuffing against the vintage Persian rugs. He burst into a private soundproof back room where the air was thick with the smell of imported tobacco and old money. Sitting casually at the circular card table was Victor Sterling, the head of a massive rival real estate syndicate. For decades, Victor and Harrison had been bitter enemies, fighting over lucrative zoning permits and downtown developments, using the most vicious tactics imaginable. But extreme desperation makes strange bedfellows, and right now Victor was the only man in Atlanta with enough liquid capital to buy Harrison's entire distressed portfolio in a single night. Harrison threw his heavy leather briefcase onto the center of the table, the sudden loud noise making Victor's massive bodyguards flinch and reach for their jackets. Harrison did not bother with pleasantries or formal handshakes. He unclasped the brass locks with shaking fingers and began frantically pulling out thick stacks of property deeds, building blueprints, and commercial zoning titles. He spread his entire life's work across the green felt of the card table, offering Victor a fire sale deal that would normally be considered absolute financial insanity. He was offering his 5 most lucrative commercial skyscrapers in the downtown district for sheer pennies on the dollar. He told Victor he needed $70 million wired to an untraceable bank account in the Bahamas by 3 in the morning, and in exchange, Victor would instantly become the undisputed king of Atlanta real estate. Harrison paced the length of the small, smoky room, dragging his hands through his thinning, sweat-soaked hair, his breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. He ranted loudly about how his treacherous, pathetic daughter had orchestrated a massive federal raid simply because she was jealous of his incredible success and bitter about her own lowly station in life. He spit on the floor, cursing his weak son Carlton and that gold-digging fiancée Paige for being too stupid to protect the family assets. He promised Victor over and over again that this was the absolute easiest money he would ever make, as long as the massive wire transfer cleared the offshore accounts before the federal injunctions completely locked down the banking system. He begged Victor to look at the paperwork, swearing the buildings were entirely clean and ready for an immediate quiet transfer of ownership. Victor sat perfectly still in his velvet wingback chair, slowly swirling a crystal glass of expensive bourbon. He did not even look at the frantic, sweating man pacing back and forth across the room. Instead, he looked down at the property deeds spread across the table, his expression completely unreadable and terrifyingly calm. He reached out with one manicured finger and casually pushed the entire stack of heavy papers back across the green felt toward Harrison. Victor took a slow, deliberate sip of his dark drink and smiled a cold, chilling smile that made the blood freeze entirely in Harrison's veins. Victor told him in a soft, quiet voice that he would not be buying a single building tonight or any other night. He explained that his top financial analysts had run a quiet, comprehensive audit on Harrison's entire portfolio just a few hours ago, expecting to find a massive goldmine of opportunity in the wake of the news breaking about the federal raids. But instead of highly valuable physical assets, Victor explained, they found a rapidly sinking ship anchored by absolute mountains of toxic, fragile debt. Harrison froze in his tracks, his face going completely pale and his hands dropping to his sides as he demanded to know what Victor was talking about. Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the card table, and looked directly into Harrison's terrified, wide eyes. He told the broken man standing before him that he could not buy the properties, even if he wanted to, because the massive complex loans holding the entire Vanguard empire together had already been called in. Victor casually mentioned that every single ounce of his toxic debt had been completely bought out yesterday afternoon by a ruthless anonymous shadow investment firm. Harrison slumped back into his chair, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound escaping his throat as the reality of Victor's words finally sank in. The shadow investment firm was not a faceless corporate entity. It was his own daughter pulling the final strings on his financial execution. He was trapped in that smoky underground room, with no money, no leverage, and absolutely no way to stop the federal agents who were inevitably waiting for him outside. His entire legacy was gone, reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale of greed and arrogance. Across town, entirely oblivious to her husband's absolute destruction, my mother Vivian was desperately clinging to the only thing she valued more than her family name: her social status. She had somehow managed to squeeze herself into her custom-beaded gown and march right through the gilded doors of the most exclusive Black elite charity gala in Atlanta. The annual country club ball was the absolute crown jewel of her social calendar, and she flatly refused to let a federal raid or my hospitalization ruin her perfect public image. She believed that if she could just maintain appearances tonight, she could spin the narrative and save her precious reputation before the morning news cycle broke the story. She stood near the towering champagne pyramid in the center of the grand ballroom, surrounded by a cluster of wealthy socialites and city officials. She was swirling a crystal flute of expensive vintage champagne with a practiced, steady hand, playing the role of the brave matriarch to absolute perfection. I could easily picture the exact expression of manufactured tragedy she wore on her face as she fed them her disgusting lies. She dramatically lowered her voice, whispering to the affluent crowd that the terrible rumors of a family feud or financial crimes were entirely false and fabricated by jealous rivals. She leaned in close to the mayor's wife and claimed with fake tears welling in her eyes that I was currently locked away in a secure psychiatric ward, suffering from a severe violent case of postpartum psychosis. She told the breathless listening crowd that I was hallucinating, having terrible paranoid delusions about the family business, and attacking my own parents in fits of medically induced rage. She painted herself as the long-suffering, heartbroken mother, simply doing her best to hold the family together, while her sick, ungrateful daughter completely lost her mind. She sighed, wiping a non-existent tear from her perfectly contoured cheek, telling them how exhausting it was to bear the burden of such a tragic family secret. The socialites murmured their sympathetic apologies, patting her arm and offering their prayers, completely buying into her flawless performance. They told her she was so strong and so brave for showing up to support the charity, despite her heavy personal burdens and the horrible stress of my supposed mental breakdown. She was just raising her glass to take another triumphant sip of champagne when the heavy, sharp feedback of a microphone echoed loudly through the massive ballroom. The live string quartet, playing softly in the corner, abruptly stopped their performance mid-note. The club president, a highly respected federal judge named Marcus Rawlings, stepped up to the main podium on the grand stage. His face was grim, and his posture was rigid as he looked out over the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. He did not welcome the guests or thank the corporate sponsors for their generous donations. Instead, his eyes locked directly onto my mother, standing near the center of the room, basking in her false sympathy. The entire ballroom fell into a dead, heavy silence as Judge Rawlings spoke directly into the microphone, his deep voice booming off the vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers. He announced to the crowd that the country club had always maintained a strict zero-tolerance morals clause for all of its members, regardless of their financial standing or historical ties to the community. He stated clearly and methodically that the club board of directors had just received undeniable authenticated evidence of severe criminal misconduct, financial fraud, and attempted murder linked directly to the Vanguard family. Vivian's fake smile instantly shattered, turning into a mask of pure frozen terror as every single head in the room slowly turned to stare directly at her. Judge Rawlings did not stop there. He informed the completely silent crowd that the club's most generous anonymous benefactor, a man who had single-handedly funded their new children's hospital wing and their expansive community outreach programs, had personally requested the immediate and permanent expulsion of Vivian and her entire family. He pointed a steady, accusing finger directly at her shivering form and told the crowd that Donovan Sterling, my husband, was the benefactor. The collective gasp from the Atlanta elite actually echoed in the massive space. My mother dropped her crystal flute, watching it shatter into 100 glittering pieces against the polished marble floor. The champagne splashed across her expensive beaded shoes, but she was too paralyzed by shock to even move. Judge Rawlings ordered Vivian to surrender her platinum membership card and vacate the premises immediately before he had her arrested for trespassing on private property. Vivian began to hyperventilate, her hands shaking violently as she looked around at the faces of her supposed friends and high society peers. There was absolutely no sympathy left in their eyes. The exact same women who had just been comforting her were now looking at her with absolute raw disgust, physically stepping away from her as if she were carrying a deadly, highly contagious disease. The whispers started rippling through the room, calling her a criminal, a liar, and a disgrace to their community. She tried to scream a defense, tried to claim it was all a terrible misunderstanding orchestrated by her sick daughter, but two massive private security guards in dark suits were already flanking her. They grabbed her firmly by the arms of her expensive gown, completely ignoring her frantic, hysterical protests. They dragged her kicking and screaming across the long ballroom floor, pulling her toward the exit doors, while she sobbed and begged them to let her go. She dug her heels into the marble, trying to stop them, but they effortlessly marched her out into the humid night air. She was thrown out into the street like common trash, while the most powerful people in the city whispered and watched the complete humiliating destruction of her precious social empire. The morning sun felt blindingly bright as Donovan gently guided me through the heavy sliding glass doors of the hospital. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was not breathing recycled sterile air that smelled of bleach and panic. The heavy, suffocating weight of fear that had anchored me to that miserable medical bed was finally gone. Right before the doctors signed my official discharge papers, we had stood together in the quiet, comforting hum of the neonatal intensive care unit. We stood silently looking through the clear, pristine incubator at our beautiful son. His vitals were perfectly stable on the glowing monitors above his head. His tiny chest was rising and falling with a strong, steady rhythm that needed absolutely no assistance from the machines anymore. The attending physicians had assured us with warm smiles that he was completely out of danger and thriving beyond all their initial expectations. Looking down at his fragile, perfect face, the burning, chaotic hatred that had consumed me since the moment of my father's violent betrayal began to cool. It did not disappear or fade away. It simply changed state. The wild, frantic rage that had made me want to scream and break things froze solid within my chest, turning into a terrifying, absolute ice-cold precision. I was no longer a panicked, bleeding mother fighting for basic survival in a hospital room. I was a predator who had calmly and meticulously backed her prey into an inescapable corner. The raw emotion was gone, replaced entirely by the calculated, ruthless business acumen I had secretly honed over the years, while my family thought I was just playing with spreadsheets in the background. Donovan drove us back to our sprawling downtown penthouse in absolute silence. The quiet between us was not tense. It was heavy with a shared, dark understanding of what was coming next. When the private elevator doors opened directly into our massive two-story office, the reality of what we had accomplished over the past few days was physically laid out before me. The expansive, polished mahogany desk sitting in the center of the room was entirely covered in thick, bound legal folders, financial ledgers, and red-tagged bank documents. These were the highly classified debt acquisition contracts. This was the very lifeblood of the Vanguard real estate empire, neatly packaged, verified, and signed over to a shadow investment firm that I controlled completely. I walked slowly over to the desk, trailing my fingers over the smooth leather covers of the portfolios. I sat down in the heavy, high-backed leather chair and began opening the files one by one. My eyes scanned the endless rows of red ink, the heavily defaulted loans, the dangerously leveraged properties, and the desperate high-interest bailouts Harrison had signed in his frantic bid to keep his sinking ship afloat. I looked at Carlton's pathetic forged signatures attempting to hide millions in missing capital and the offshore routing numbers Paige had so willingly traded for a plea deal she would never actually get. Every single ounce of their toxic, crushing debt now belonged exclusively to me. I owned the walls around them, the ground beneath their expensive Italian shoes, and the very names printed on their corporate letterheads. They were completely financially ruined. But as I sat there staring at the absolute mathematical destruction of their wealth, I realized something fundamental. Bankrupting them in secret was simply not enough. Stripping away their bank accounts, liquidating their estates, and watching them get thrown out of their elite country clubs would certainly hurt them, but it would not destroy the core of their toxic arrogance. My father and my brother worshipped power above all else. Their entire identity, their entire reason for breathing, was wrapped up in their corporate titles, their boardroom dominance, and the false gleaming legacy of the Vanguard Corporation. They treated that massive company headquarters like an impenetrable sanctuary, a sacred temple where they were untouchable gods who could abuse silence and discard people like me without a single consequence. For decades, I had been forced to sit in the very back row of that boardroom taking notes while they took credit for my ideas and mocked my ambition. If I simply foreclosed on them from afar, they would spend the rest of their miserable lives playing the victim, pretending they were unfairly martyred by a cruel market or a faceless corporate entity. They needed to know exactly who ended their reign. I looked up at Donovan, who was leaning casually against the edge of the desk, watching me with those dark, endlessly calculating eyes. He already knew exactly what I was thinking before the words even left my mouth. I told him I did not just want to seize their assets from the shadows and watch them bleed out on paper. I wanted to walk right into their sacred temple and pull the marble pillars down directly on top of their heads. I wanted to strip them of their power, their executive titles, and their unearned dignity in front of the exact same shareholders and board members they had spent decades lying to. I wanted them to look their total destruction directly in the eye and know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the daughter they had treated like worthless, disposable garbage was the one holding the match. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Donovan's face, completely transforming his features. He simply nodded and pushed a sleek silver tablet across the polished mahogany desk toward me. The screen displayed an urgent internal corporate memo that had been intercepted by his elite security team just an hour ago. Harrison, having just foolishly bailed himself out of jail with his last remaining stolen dollars, had panicked and called an emergency shareholder meeting for that very afternoon. He was planning to stand in front of the board, spin a web of desperate lies, blame his children for the federal raid, and try to force through an emergency liquidation vote to save his own skin. The timing was absolutely perfect. I pushed myself up from the desk, feeling a sudden massive surge of pure, powerful adrenaline washing away the last lingering physical aches of my surgery. I walked purposefully into our master dressing room and bypassed the soft, comfortable recovery clothes I had worn before. Instead, I pulled out a razor-sharp, tailored charcoal suit that fit my body like custom armor. I paired it with simple, elegant black stilettos and tied my hair back into a tight, unforgiving knot at the base of my neck. Looking in the full-length mirror, I did not see the forgotten, neglected Vanguard daughter anymore. I saw the merciless executioner they had created through their own endless greed. Donovan met me by the private elevator looking like a devastating king, going to war in his dark, bespoke suit and crisp white shirt. He wrapped his large hand firmly around mine, his thumb tracing the back of my knuckles as the steel doors closed and lowered us down to the secure private garage. Our tactical security team was already waiting silently standing watch around a gleaming black Rolls-Royce with tinted windows. The heavy passenger door was opened for us, and we slid into the immaculate, cool leather interior. The driver looked back through the privacy partition awaiting his final instructions. I leaned forward, my voice completely calm and perfectly steady, telling him to take us directly to the Vanguard corporate headquarters. The luxury car pulled smoothly out into the busy city streets, carrying us toward the final boardroom battle, where I would finally wipe my family off the corporate map forever. The atmosphere inside the Vanguard corporate boardroom was absolutely suffocating. The air conditioning was running at full blast, but the massive room felt like a blazing furnace. 20 of the most ruthless investors and board members in Atlanta sat around the enormous polished mahogany table, their faces twisted into identical masks of rage and panic. The heavy oak-paneled walls that had guarded the family's secrets for decades suddenly felt like a prison closing in on them. Harrison stood at the head of the table, sweating profusely through his ruined designer shirt. He was gripping the edges of the mahogany wood so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He was desperately trying to project the image of a powerful, untouchable CEO, but his voice was trembling. He lied through his teeth, swearing to the angry shareholders that the federal raid on the building was nothing more than a massive misunderstanding. He promised them that his lawyers would have the injunctions lifted by sunset and that their money was perfectly safe. But nobody in the room was buying his pathetic performance. The board members were frantically checking their phones, watching the company's stock absolutely plummet in real time as news of the federal probe leaked to the financial press. Sitting right next to him, Carlton was completely falling apart. My brother was a devastatingly pathetic sight. His arm was still strapped tightly into a medical sling from his dislocated shoulder, and his face was bruised and swollen. He was literally sobbing at the table, wiping snot and tears from his face with his uninjured hand. Carlton was begging the investors not to pull their capital, crying out that he had been tricked by a professional con artist and that Page had manipulated his accounts. He whined that it was not his fault the offshore money was frozen and pleaded for just one more week to fix the massive gaping holes in their ledgers. His pathetic whining only made the board members angrier. They shouted over him, demanding to know who had bought up all their toxic debt yesterday afternoon and why Vanguard no longer owned its own flagship properties. Harrison slammed his fist on the table, demanding order. He puffed out his chest, trying to summon the old, terrifying authority he used to wield over us. He shouted that he was still the chairman of the board and that he maintained absolute total control over the Vanguard empire. He swore that he would personally hunt down the shadow investment firm that had bought their debt and force them to sell it back. He promised the room that no one could ever dethrone him in his own sanctuary. He did not even get to finish his sentence. The heavy, solid oak double doors of the boardroom were suddenly kicked open with such violent force that they slammed against the interior walls with a deafening crack. The entire room jumped in their seats. The angry shouts of the investors died instantly in their throats. A tactical team of men wearing immaculate black suits marched into the room, moving with terrifying military precision. They completely ignored the outraged gasps of the board members and the frantic yelling of the building security guards who were trailing uselessly behind them. The men in black instantly formed two perfectly straight lines, creating a human corridor that led directly from the doorway to the head of the mahogany table. The room fell into an absolute dead silence. Nobody dared to breathe. And then I walked through the doors. I did not look like the quiet, forgotten daughter who used to sit in the corner taking notes while they stole my ideas. I stepped into the room wearing a sharp, tailored, dark crimson power suit that fit me like a suit of armor. The deep blood-red fabric stood out violently against the dark wood and gray suits of the boardroom. My black stilettos clicked rhythmically against the marble floor, echoing loudly in the completely silent room. My eyes were like daggers locked directly onto my father. I let all the lingering pain and rejection die, completely replacing it with ice-cold calculation. Donovan walked just one step behind me, a silent, towering wall of absolute lethal power, ensuring that not a single person in that room would even think about moving toward me. The reaction of the board was instantaneous. Jaws dropped and eyes widened in absolute shock. They had known me for years as Harrison's weak, submissive assistant, but they did not recognize the woman walking toward them now. Carlton stopped crying mid-sob, his mouth hanging open as he stared at me in pure horror. He shrank back into his leather chair, looking like a terrified little boy who knew a monster had just entered the room. Harrison's face cycled through an entire spectrum of emotions. First it was shock, then utter confusion, and finally a deep, violent purple rage. He could not comprehend how I was standing there, out of the hospital, walking into his sacred sanctuary like I owned the place. He slammed both his hands down onto the table, sending a water glass tipping over and spilling across the wood. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his booming voice to intimidate me one last time. He looked at the men in the black suits and then glared at me with absolute dripping venom. He barked at the top of his lungs, demanding to know who let you in here. I did not stop walking. I did not flinch or look away. I marched straight up to the head of the table, forcing him to physically step back. I raised the heavy, thick dossier containing every single debt acquisition contract, every foreclosed loan, and every transferred deed. I slammed the files down onto the polished mahogany table with a sharp, violent crack that made my father jump. I looked right into his terrified eyes and told him the person who owns 51% of this circus. The silence in the room stretched out for what felt like an eternity before Harrison finally broke it with a harsh, barking laugh. He looked around the table at the terrified board members, acting like I had just told the most ridiculous joke he had ever heard. He pointed a shaking finger at my face and told the room that his daughter was clearly having a severe mental breakdown. He ordered the building security guards to grab me and drag me out of the boardroom, claiming I was a hysterical postpartum mother who had escaped from a secure psychiatric ward and stolen some fake documents. Carlton chimed in, his voice high and reedy, whining that I did not have 2 cents to rub together, let alone the billions of dollars required to buy a controlling stake in the Vanguard real estate empire. He told the panicked investors not to listen to a single word, I said, calling me a jealous, bitter failure who just wanted to ruin their highly important meeting because I was angry about being left out of the family business. I did not even look at my pathetic brother. I kept my eyes locked directly on the board of directors, the wealthy men and women who had blindly trusted my father with their vast family fortunes. I reached down and calmly opened the thick, heavy dossier I had slammed onto the mahogany table. I began to read out the exact private account numbers, hidden routing codes, and international wire transfer logs that my father and brother had been desperately trying to conceal for the past 5 years. I explained to the completely silent room that I had not just been sitting at home playing the good, quiet, submissive wife all these years. I had been building highly complex, custom forensic accounting algorithms specifically designed to track exactly where their investment money was actually going. I passed thick, heavy copies of the verified financial ledgers down the long table, watching with immense satisfaction as the color completely drained from the faces of the most powerful investors in the city. I detailed exactly how my father had systematically over-leveraged every single one of their flagship commercial properties, using fraudulent, inflated appraisals and phantom collateral that did not even exist. I explained how the shadow investment firm that had swooped in to silently buy their massive mountain of toxic debt was entirely owned and operated by me. I had watched them foolishly bleed the company dry, making terrible, arrogant mistakes, and then I had stepped in and purchased their massive debt for absolute pennies on the dollar, right out from under their noses. I had legally and meticulously converted every single ounce of that toxic, crushing debt into hard voting equity, giving me absolute, unquestionable majority control over the entire Vanguard Corporation. Harrison lunged forward like a cornered animal trying to snatch the authenticated papers out of the hands of the lead investor, but Donovan simply stepped into his path, blocking him with a look so lethal my father instantly backed away. Harrison was sweating profusely now, gasping for air as he tried to stammer out a coherent defense. He claimed the numbers were entirely fabricated, that I was illegally manipulating the data to stage a hostile corporate takeover and ruin his flawless reputation. That was exactly when I pulled out the specific files regarding Carlton. I flipped to a highlighted page that showed a direct, unencrypted financial pipeline from the Vanguard corporate emergency reserve accounts straight into my brother's personal offshore slush funds. I read aloud the exact dates and staggering multi-million-dollar amounts Carlton had blatantly embezzled just to buy Paige those ridiculous diamond tennis bracelets and custom-imported sports cars. I did not stop there. I exposed the massive underground gambling debts Carlton had recklessly racked up over the past 3 years. Debts he had quietly and illegally paid off using the restricted shareholder dividend fund. Carlton's bruised, swollen face went completely white, and he slumped back in his leather chair, making a pathetic choking sound as the elite board members turned to glare at him with absolute, pure, unadulterated disgust. I moved seamlessly onto my father, exposing the intricate layered web of offshore accounts he had secretly set up in the Cayman Islands and the Swiss Alps. I showed the board the exact, undeniable paper trail, proving Harrison had been intentionally bleeding, his own company dry funneling millions in investor capital into his private, untouchable reserves, while sitting at this very mahogany table and promising them record-breaking quarterly returns. I told the horrified investors that my father had known the federal raid was coming for weeks, and his entire cowardly plan for this emergency meeting was to force a rapid liquidation vote, take his massive golden parachute, and leave every single one of them holding the bag for his devastating federal crimes. The boardroom erupted into absolute deafening chaos. The wealthy, polished investors who had been sitting quietly just moments before were now standing up and screaming violently at my father. They threw the heavy financial packets back at him, demanding their stolen money, calling him a disgusting thief and an absolute fraud. One of the oldest, most respected board members, a man who had known my father for over 30 years, leaned across the expensive table and told Harrison right to his face that he was going to personally use every cent he had left to see him rot in a federal maximum security prison. The unshakable loyalty and fear my father had carefully cultivated for decades evaporated in a single instant, replaced entirely by a violent, ravenous demand for immediate justice. I raised my hand slightly, and the imposing men in the black suits stepped forward, silencing the chaotic room with their terrifying physical presence. I looked down at my father, who was now trembling uncontrollably, his expensive custom suit completely soaked in cold sweat. He looked incredibly small and pathetic and entirely broken. All the terrifying, imposing power he used to hold over me was completely gone, stripped away by the undeniable mathematical truth of his own pathetic greed. I looked out over the remaining enraged board members and officially called for an emergency vote of no confidence. I stated clearly and loudly for the official corporate record that as the verified holder of 51% of the Vanguard voting shares, I was exercising my legal right to bypass standard parliamentary procedure. I did not even wait for anyone in the room to second the motion. I looked directly into my father's terrified, bloodshot eyes and told him the final vote was unanimous. I legally and permanently stripped Harrison of his title as Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the board, tearing away his entire identity with a single sentence. I turned my head slightly to look at Carlton, who was openly weeping into his good hand, looking like a crushed insect. I informed the silent room that Carlton's executive privileges, his infinite corporate credit lines, and his building security access were permanently revoked, effective immediately. I told them both that they were officially trespassing on my private property and that they had exactly 3 minutes to gather whatever pitiful personal belongings they could carry before my security team physically threw them out into the crowded city street. Harrison tried to speak, tried to form one last desperate begging plea, but his voice completely failed him, turning into a dry, raspy wheeze. He looked around the massive room, frantically begging for a single sympathetic face to save him. But he found absolutely nothing but cold, hard, unforgiving contempt. The great, untouchable empire he had built on lies, manipulation, and abuse had finally collapsed around him, and I was the only one standing triumphant in the smoking rubble. The crushing silence in the room was only broken by the ragged, pathetic sound of my father's breathing. Harrison realized with absolute terrifying clarity that his money was gone, his power was stripped, and his precious empire had been completely devoured. The arrogant mask he had worn for his entire life completely shattered, leaving nothing but a desperate, terrified old man in its place. His legs suddenly gave out beneath him, and he slumped forward, grabbing the edge of the heavy mahogany table to keep from collapsing entirely onto the polished floor. His expensive silk tie was crooked, and his face was a sickly pale gray. He looked up at me with wide, watering eyes, completely abandoning his aggressive corporate posturing. He decided in that moment to play his final desperate card. He decided to play the loving father. His hands were physically shaking as he reached out toward me across the dark wood of the boardroom table. His voice cracked, turning into a pathetic whining plea that echoed off the heavy oak walls. He begged me to stop and think about what I was doing. He told the silent room that blood was thicker than water, and that family was the most important thing in the world. He cried out that I could not do this to my own flesh and blood, claiming that he had given me life and put a roof over my head. He sobbed that he had raised me and fed me and sacrificed his entire life to build this company so that his children would never have to struggle. He actually had the sickening audacity to look me right in the eye and tell me that he loved me and that he was my father. I stood perfectly still, looking down at his trembling, outstretched hand with absolute pure revulsion. The wealthy investors and board members watched in stunned, breathless silence as the great Harrison Vanguard begged his discarded, abused daughter for mercy. I did not flinch, and I did not step away. Instead, I stepped right into his personal space, the sharp click of my black stilettos sounding like a judge striking a gavel. I kept my voice dangerously low but crystal clear, ensuring that every single person in that massive room heard exactly what kind of monster he really was. I leaned in close and asked him if he remembered my 12th birthday. I paused and corrected myself, asking if he remembered Carlton's 14th birthday, which conveniently happened to fall on the exact same humid summer weekend. I let the memory flood the room, describing the events with a cold, detached precision that made the board members physically uncomfortable. I told him how I was 12 years old and curled into a tight, agonizing ball on the cold tile floor of the upstairs guest bathroom. I was screaming in absolute blinding pain, sweating through my clothes while my appendix was actively rupturing inside my body. I described how the loud, pulsing music and the cheerful laughter from Carlton's lavish backyard pool party echoed through the window while I was literally begging for my life. I reminded Harrison how he had angrily pushed open the bathroom door, looked down at his agonizingly sick 12-year-old daughter in pure disgust, and told me to shut my mouth and stop being so incredibly dramatic. I made sure the investors heard every single word of my story. I told them how my father had flatly refused to take me to the emergency room because he had highly important clients drinking expensive vintage champagne on the patio, and he absolutely could not be bothered to deal with my pathetic attention-seeking tantrums. He had turned his back on me, locked the bathroom door behind him, and gone back out to celebrate his golden child. I told the horrified room that our elderly housekeeper had to sneak me out the back door, wrap me in a blanket, and call a taxi to save my life while my father drank cocktails by the pool. A collective shocked gasp rippled through the boardroom. The investors looked at Harrison with deep, unadulterated disgust. Carlton just stared blankly at his own expensive shoes, far too cowardly to even look up and acknowledge his part in the twisted family history. Harrison tried to stammer out a pathetic, weak excuse, claiming his memory was foggy and that he simply had not realized how serious my medical condition was at the time. He tried to say he was just a stressed parent, making a mistake, but I cut him off instantly, slicing through his pathetic lies with a voice made of pure frozen steel. I told him that real fathers protect their children. I told him that real fathers do not treat their daughters like acceptable collateral damage just to ensure their sons are comfortable. Then I delivered the final absolute crushing blow. The terrible defining memory that had finally shattered whatever tiny fragment of a soul I had left for this toxic family. I leaned down until I was inches from his sweating, terrified face, and I stripped away his title as a father forever. I told him, "You are not my father. You are simply the blind, vicious man who hit me in the head with a heavy metal tripod when I was 8 months pregnant, just because I dared to stand up and question your absolute authority." The absolute horrific truth of those words hung suspended in the heavy, suffocating air of the boardroom. Harrison's mouth opened and closed silently, like a suffocating fish. The complete monstrous reality of his violent abuse was finally dragged out of the dark shadows and laid completely bare in front of the very people he had spent his entire life trying to impress. The board members looked physically ill. Several of them actually pushed their heavy leather chairs back, physically distancing themselves from him as if his cruelty was a contagious disease. He was no longer a respected, brilliant businessman. He was a violent, pathetic abuser who was finally facing his ultimate executioner. Donovan stood perfectly still behind me, a lethal, looming shadow whose eyes promised absolute death if Harrison even twitched in my direction. I did not give my father another single second to speak, to beg, or to spin another manipulative lie. His time was completely up. I stood perfectly straight, smoothing the front of my crimson suit, and turned my back on him, entirely dismissing his existence. I raised my hand and gave a sharp, silent signal to the tactical security team waiting dutifully by the heavy oak doors. The imposing men in the dark suits stepped forward, immediately, moving with swift, terrifying precision. They grabbed Harrison firmly by the arms of his expensive, ruined suit jacket and hauled him roughly to his feet, completely ignoring his panicked, sputtering protests. I looked directly at the head of my security detail and gave my final, absolute orders. I told them to march Harrison directly to his corner office and watch him pack a single standard cardboard box with his personal items. I instructed the guards to give him exactly 3 minutes to clear out decades of his toxic life and to physically force him out the front glass doors of the building if he hesitated for even a single second. Harrison tried to dig his expensive leather shoes into the thick carpet, but the security team effortlessly dragged him away, pulling the screaming, thrashing former king of the Vanguard Empire out of the boardroom and throwing him toward the exit, while the entire board watched his pathetic final destruction in complete and total silence. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind my screaming father, leaving a ringing silence in the massive boardroom. The wealthy investors who had just witnessed the absolute brutal execution of the Vanguard patriarch slowly turned their gaze back to the mahogany table. Sitting there completely abandoned and shaking like a terrified child was my brother Carlton. His broken arm was still cradled in his tight medical sling, and his bruised face was slick with a disgusting mixture of sweat and tears. He looked around the massive room, desperately searching the faces of the elite executives for a single ounce of pity, but he found absolutely nothing. The powerful men and women who used to kiss his ring and laugh at his arrogant, childish jokes were now looking at him like he was a diseased rat. They had just seen the undeniable mathematical proof of his massive theft, his endless gambling addictions, and his pathetic secret slush funds. They knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that he had stolen their hard-earned capital to fund his repulsive lifestyle, and they wanted blood. Carlton suddenly realized with absolute horrifying clarity that his impenetrable shield was completely gone. Our father, the great Harrison Vanguard, was no longer there to bail him out of trouble, to cover up his crimes, or to violently silence his victims. The mighty shadow that Carlton had hidden behind for his entire pathetic life had been forcibly dragged out of the building. Carlton was completely, utterly alone. A wet, miserable sob ripped through his throat, echoing loudly in the tense, silent room. He slowly slid out of his high-backed executive leather chair, and to the absolute shock of everyone in the room, he actually dropped down onto both of his knees. The sharp sound of his knees hitting the cold, polished marble floor was sickening. He began to shuffle forward, crawling on the ground like an insect toward where I stood at the head of the table. He was weeping openly now, his expensive silk tie dragging uselessly on the dusty floor as he looked up at me with wide, terrified, bloodshot eyes. He started babbling uncontrollably, his voice cracking and pitching as he begged me for mercy. He threw away every single ounce of his pride, groveling right at the pointed tips of my black stilettos. He swore to me that the massive embezzlement was not his fault. He frantically shifted the entire blame onto his fiancée Paige, claiming that she was a manipulative, greedy gold digger who had forced him into terrible, inescapable debt. He cried out that Paige was a heartless monster who demanded custom-imported sports cars and rare diamond tennis bracelets, and that she had viciously threatened to leave him if he did not siphon money directly from the corporate reserve accounts. He happily and effortlessly threw the woman he supposedly loved straight under the bus, reminding the disgustingly silent boardroom that she was already sitting in a cold jail cell waiting for a plea deal that was never going to happen. He sobbed that she had ruined his entire life and that he was just a naive, innocent victim of her brilliant feminine manipulation. Carlton reached out with his uninjured hand and grabbed the hem of my dark crimson suit jacket, his fingers trembling violently as he gripped the fabric. He begged me not to throw him out into the harsh street. He cried that he had absolutely no money, no offshore accounts left, and completely nowhere to go. He looked up at me with snot running down his swollen face and pleaded for a job. The golden boy of the Vanguard Empire, the arrogant, untouchable heir who used to mock my ambitions, steal my hard work, and laugh at my pain, was now literally begging his sister for a minimum wage paycheck. He swore he would do anything I asked. He told me he would clean the filthy public bathrooms, he would empty the rotting trash cans, he would sweep the lobby floors as a lowly janitor, if I would just let him stay in the corporate building and earn enough to survive. The elite board members watched this pathetic display with their jaws practically hitting the mahogany table, completely mesmerized by the total catastrophic degradation of the man who had stolen millions from their private family funds. I looked down at my brother, feeling absolutely no pity, no remorse, and no lingering familial loyalty. The ice-cold precision in my chest did not thaw for a single second. I watched him debase himself, watched him crawl on the floor and cry like a beaten dog, and I simply nodded my head slowly. The gentle motion caused a sudden, frantic spark of desperate hope to ignite in his tear-filled eyes. I reached into my sleek leather portfolio and smoothly pulled out a crisp, heavy piece of official document paper. I placed it gently onto the edge of the polished mahogany table, right at his eye level. I picked up a heavy silver fountain pen and held it out toward him, offering him the exact lifeline he was so desperately begging for. Carlton scrambled up from his knees, almost tripping over his own expensive leather shoes in his desperate, frantic haste. He was laughing and sobbing at the exact same time, thanking me profusely, telling me over and over again that I was a good sister and a deeply merciful person. He wiped his bruised face with the back of his trembling hand and eagerly snatched the silver pen from my fingers. He leaned heavily against the edge of the table, practically vibrating with overwhelming relief as he prepared to sign what he believed was his humiliating but life-saving employment contract. He looked down at the crisp white paper, completely ready to blindly sign away his executive dignity to become the corporate janitor just to stay off the streets. I watched the exact brilliant second his eyes actually registered the bold black letters printed across the top of the page. The frantic, relieved smile completely vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a mask of absolute bloodless terror. The heavy silver pen slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered loudly onto the wooden table, rolling away from him. He began to shake his head violently, backing away from the document, as if it were radiating lethal poison. It was not a humble employment contract for a janitorial position. It was a direct, highly classified federal subpoena. It explicitly detailed multiple massive counts of highly coordinated wire fraud, grand larceny, and deliberate investor deception. It perfectly outlined every single illegal offshore wire transfer he had made and every fake property appraisal he had ever signed. Before Carlton could even open his mouth to scream or beg or formulate another pathetic lie, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung violently open for the second time that afternoon. My tactical security team stepped aside, making a wide, clear path for a squad of grim-faced, fully armed federal police officers. Their heavy boots thudded loudly against the marble floor as they marched directly toward my brother, completely ignoring the stunned, wealthy executives sitting around the table. Carlton's knees buckled again as all the blood rushed from his head. but two massive officers grabbed him firmly by the arms, hauling him up and shoving him aggressively against the edge of the mahogany table. The sharp, terrifying metallic click of cold steel handcuffs echoed sharply in the quiet room as they locked his wrists tightly together behind his back, completely ignoring his frantic cries of pain regarding his injured shoulder. The lead officer stepped right into his personal space, looked him dead in the eye, and began reading him. His Miranda rights in a loud, booming voice that shattered the very last illusion of his privileged world. Carlton began to wail loudly, kicking and thrashing like a trapped wild animal. But the officers effortlessly dragged him backward, pulling him out of the boardroom in heavy chains while the entire executive board watched the absolute final humiliating destruction of the Vanguard legacy. The storm hit Atlanta just after midnight, a brutal, torrential downpour that turned the city streets into churning, violent rivers. Thunder shook the thick, bulletproof glass of my penthouse windows, but inside, it was perfectly quiet and perfectly warm. I stood looking out over the glowing city skyline, holding a crystal glass of water, feeling the deep, absolute silence of my new empire. My phone had been ringing endlessly for hours, but I had ignored every single call. The federal agents had worked fast, freezing every Vanguard account, every personal credit card, and every hidden trust fund. My family was completely locked out of the luxurious world they used to own. Down in the grand marble lobby of my building, the night concierge called my private line. His voice was hesitant as he informed me that a woman was causing a massive disturbance outside the main security gates. He said she was completely soaked, covered in mud, and hysterically demanding to see me. I did not have to ask who it was. I told the concierge to unlock the exterior plaza gate and told Donovan to get an umbrella. We took the private elevator down to the ground floor. The heavy glass doors of the lobby slid open and the freezing, violent wind instantly whipped across the covered entrance. The rain was falling in thick, heavy sheets bouncing off the illuminated pavement. Right there in the center of the driving rain, kneeling on the hard, wet concrete, was my mother. Vivian was a devastating sight. The woman who had spent her entire life obsessing over country club status and exclusive designer labels was now completely unrecognizable. Her expensive silk blouse was plastered to her shivering frame, ruined by the dark mud and the freezing rain. Her perfect hair was matted to her skull, and thick black streaks of expensive mascara ran down her cheeks like dark bruises. She must have walked for miles through the dangerous storm after her private cars were impounded by the feds, and her black cards were declined by every luxury hotel in the city. She looked up and saw me standing under the grand awning. Donovan stepped forward instantly, holding a massive black umbrella over my head, ensuring that not a single drop of the freezing rain touched my pristine clothes. I stood there looking down at the woman who had given birth to me, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger, no sorrow. There was just an immense hollow void where a daughter's love used to be. Vivian let out a jagged, heartbreaking sob and tried to crawl forward on the wet concrete, scratching her bare knees against the rough stone. She reached out her shaking hands toward my dry, warm shoes, but Donovan subtly shifted his massive weight, and she instantly pulled back, terrified of the silent security guard. She looked up at me with wild, desperate eyes and started begging. Her voice was barely audible over the roaring thunder, but I heard every pathetic, whining word. She begged me to call off the federal agents and fix this nightmare. She cried that Harrison was an old man with high blood pressure and that a federal prison sentence would absolutely kill him. She sobbed for Carlton, whining that her precious boy was terrified and sitting in a cold holding cell and that he could not survive behind bars. She begged me to remember that we were a family, that we shared the exact same blood, and that a daughter could not do this to her own flesh and blood. I just stared at her, listening to the violent rain crash against the flooded pavement. She did not beg for forgiveness for herself. She did not apologize for a lifetime of turning a blind eye while my father verbally and physically abused me. She did not apologize for treating me like a worthless servant while she treated Carlton like a fragile king. Even now, completely ruined and kneeling in the freezing mud, Her only concern was saving the greedy men who had destroyed my life. She shivered violently, her teeth chattering loudly, and begged me to just let her come inside. She cried out that she was freezing to death, that her feet were bleeding, and that she had absolutely nowhere else to go. She looked at the warm, glowing light of the extravagant lobby behind me and pleaded for just one night in a warm bed. She promised she would leave quietly in the morning if I would just show her a tiny shred of human decency and let her out of the storm. I looked down into her desperate, pleading eyes and told her no. My voice was completely flat, cutting through the loud noise of the storm like a blade of solid ice. I told her that the glowing lobby behind me was for residents and their welcomed guests only. I reminded her of the time I was 16 years old and she locked me out of the house in the dead of winter because I was exactly 5 minutes late for curfew. I reminded her how I sat shivering on the frozen back porch for 6 hours, while she sat inside drinking expensive wine by the roaring fireplace, teaching me a strict lesson about respect and punctuality. I told her that tonight she was simply learning a lesson about consequences. Vivian gasped violently, wrapping her arms around her own shivering body, letting out a low, miserable wail of pure, utter defeat. She realized in that exact horrifying moment that there was absolutely no warmth left for her here. The quiet, submissive daughter she had neglected and discarded had finally turned to solid stone. I calmly reached out my hand, and Donovan placed a neatly folded plastic package into my palm. I looked down at my shivering, pathetic mother and stepped right to the edge of the dry concrete. I dropped the package directly onto the wet pavement right next to her bleeding knees. The clear, waterproof plastic hit the puddles with a soft smack. Inside the sealed bag was a standard-issue gray janitorial uniform and a blank Vanguard corporate employment application. I looked down at her completely ruined face as she stared in absolute horror at the cheap gray uniform. I told her that I was not completely heartless and that my company was currently hiring night shift cleaning staff for the lowest basement levels. I watched the very last shred of her arrogant country club pride absolutely shatter into dust, and then I delivered the final blow. I looked her right in the eye and told her, "You were right. I always have to clean up this family's mess." 6 months later, the heavy, solid oak doors of the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta slammed shut with a resounding thud that echoed like a final hammer blow across the packed gallery. The air inside the courtroom was thick and suffocating, filled with the frantic clicking of cameras and the hushed, eager whispers of the local press. All of the vile, disgusting secrets of the Vanguard family, the decades of blatant fraud, the calculated abuse, the sickening greed, they were all now permanently etched into the public record for the entire world to see. The absolute arrogance that had shielded them for so long was completely stripped away under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the justice system. Harrison stood before the federal judge, looking like a hollowed-out, withered shell of the terrifying, imposing patriarch he used to be. His expensive, custom-tailored suits had been confiscated and replaced by a stiff, scratchy, bright orange prison jumpsuit that hung loosely off his rapidly shrinking frame. He trembled violently, gripping the edge of the defense table as the judge read off the massive, exhaustive list of his federal crimes. The judge cited the staggering scale of his offshore tax evasion, the deliberate malicious deception of his loyal investors, and the shameless funneling of corporate funds into his own private accounts. Harrison looked around the gallery, desperately searching for his old, powerful political friends, the judges and senators he used to bribe. But every single one of them had completely abandoned him. The judge stared down at him with absolute, pure, unadulterated contempt and handed down a devastating sentence of 10 years in a maximum security federal prison. There was no golden parachute waiting for him, no highly paid legal team ready to file endless appeals to save him. There was just the cold, hard, concrete reality of a tiny, isolated cell where the great Harrison Vanguard would slowly rot away and likely spend the rest of his miserable life completely forgotten. Carlton was brought up next, and he was an even more sickeningly pathetic sight. My brother openly wept at the defense table, his face buried in his hands as he hysterically begged the stern federal judge for leniency. He sobbed loudly, claiming that he was just a confused, naive victim who was only following his dominating father's strict orders. He whined that he had a severe, untreatable gambling addiction and that he desperately needed a luxury rehabilitation facility instead of a harsh prison sentence. He desperately tried to play the innocent, manipulated golden boy one last time, but the intricate, bulletproof paper trail of financial algorithms I had provided to the federal investigators was absolutely undeniable. The judge violently silenced his pathetic, sniveling excuses with a swift, sharp strike of the wooden gavel and sentenced my brother to 5 solid years in federal prison. Carlton's weak knees completely gave out beneath him, and he collapsed into a heap on the floor. The armed federal marshals had to physically drag him away by his armpits, his terrified, high-pitched sobs echoing endlessly down the long, polished marble hallway as he was taken away in heavy chains. Page received the absolute harshest and most satisfying blow of all. The federal investigators had dug deep into her massive, intricate web of lies and uncovered a staggering, highly organized network of multiple severe federal crimes. She had not just been manipulating my foolish, arrogant brother, she had been actively running a sophisticated criminal syndicate for years, utilizing massive wire fraud, systemic identity theft, and international money laundering across multiple state lines. She stood at the podium, her fake, sweet, innocent facade completely melted away, leaving only a hardened, bitter, furious criminal glaring venomously at the judge. When the crushing sentence of 15 years was officially handed down, she did not shed a single tear. She just stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched tight as the heavy steel handcuffs were aggressively locked around her wrists, sealing her fate for the next decade and a half. My mother, Vivian, had miraculously managed to avoid a direct federal indictment simply because she had intentionally kept her perfectly manicured hands entirely clean of the corporate ledgers, always preferring to just blindly and greedily spend the stolen money without asking questions. However, her punishment was perhaps the most beautiful and poetic justice of all. Completely stripped of her luxury assets, her exclusive country club memberships, and her massive, heavily mortgaged estates, she was left drowning under a suffocating mountain of crippling, inescapable debt. The IRS had swooped in and seized absolutely everything she owned, right down to her extensive designer shoe collection, leaving her completely and utterly penniless. To simply survive, she had been forced to take the absolute lowest-paying, degrading job she could possibly find. Vivian, the arrogant, snobbish woman who used to fire hard-working maids for using the wrong brand of silver polish, was now pushing a heavy, dirty mop bucket wearing a cheap, stained gray uniform. She was forced to work as a night shift sanitation worker cleaning up human waste at the exact same downtown hospital where I had been admitted during my pregnancy. She spent her long, grueling nights scrubbing the very floors where she had once walked in her expensive designer heels to sneer and look down upon her injured, bleeding daughter. I did not attend the sentencing hearing. I had absolutely no desire to sit in a crowded courtroom and watch the final pathetic gasps of a toxic family that had spent decades trying to systematically destroy my mind and my spirit. Instead, I was sitting comfortably behind the massive, sleek mahogany desk in my immaculate new corner office at the very top of the Vanguard Tower. The sprawling city of Atlanta stretched out below my floor-to-ceiling windows, a vast glittering empire that was finally under my absolute unquestionable control. Donovan stood silently by the heavy glass door, a steady, dark, reassuring presence, as I opened a thick leather binder sitting squarely in the center of my desk. Inside was a stack of official city zoning documents and finalized demolition permits. I picked up my heavy silver fountain pen and smoothly and deliberately signed my name on the dotted line officially authorizing the complete and total demolition of the old Vanguard family estate in Buckhead. I was going to send a fleet of massive bulldozers to tear down those towering wrought iron gates. those suffocating dark oak-paneled walls, and every single miserable, terrifying memory trapped inside that toxic, imposing mansion. I was going to watch the heavy machinery crush the exact sweeping marble staircase, where I had always been made to feel so small and insignificant. I was not going to sell the cleared land to wealthy developers or build another gaudy monument to corporate greed. I had already commissioned the finest architects in the city to draw up the blueprints to build a state-of-the-art foundation and massive, fully funded sanctuary shelter for abused Black women right on top of the crushed rubble of my father's legacy. I was going to take the exact sprawling estate where I had been made to feel so worthless, so terrified, and so entirely unloved, and I was going to transform it into an impenetrable fortress of healing legal aid and absolute undeniable power. I closed the heavy leather binder, set the silver pen down on the polished wood, and looked out at the bright, clear morning sky, knowing with absolute certainty that the Vanguard name and the future finally belonged entirely to me. The sterile scent of the hospital corridor no longer filled me with the icy, suffocating dread that had gripped my chest for the past 6 months. The sharp, rhythmic beeping of the medical monitors that used to sound like a terrifying countdown had slowly transformed into a beautiful, steady lullaby of survival. I stood quietly inside the neonatal intensive care unit, looking down into the small, clear plastic crib that had been my entire world since the night my family tried to destroy me. Inside, wrapped tightly in a soft white and blue striped blanket, was my beautiful baby boy. He was no longer the fragile, desperately tiny infant, clinging to life, connected to a terrifying web of federal machines and oxygen tubes. He was strong now. His cheeks were full and flushed with a healthy, warm pink color, and his tiny chest rose and fell in a perfect, deep, steady rhythm that mirrored my own breathing. The head nurse walked into the quiet room with a gentle, warm smile and handed me the final official discharge papers. I signed my name smoothly on the dotted line, feeling a profound, overwhelming wave of absolute relief wash over my entire soul. I gently reached down into the plastic crib and slid my hands beneath his small, warm body, lifting him up and pressing him securely against my chest. The sheer physical weight of him in my arms was the most incredible grounding sensation I had ever felt. I rested my chin gently against the top of his soft, dark hair, breathing in the sweet, pure scent of newborn life and fresh, clean soap. I closed my eyes and listened to the strong, steady thump of his tiny heartbeat echoing beautifully against my own skin. In that quiet, sacred moment, I knew with absolute certainty that the vicious bleeding cycle of Vanguard trauma ended right here in this room. My son would never know the cold, calculating cruelty of Harrison. He would never experience the shallow, narcissistic neglect of Vivian. He would never have to endure the violent, selfish jealousy of Carlton or the venomous greed of Paige. He would only know absolute safety. He would only know genuine, unconditional affection, and he would only ever know a mother who would gladly tear down the entire world to protect him. I felt a heavy, familiar warmth wrap securely around my shoulders. Donovan stepped up right behind me, enveloping both me and our infant son in his massive, strong arms. He rested his cheek against my temple, his chest broad and solid against my back. He did not say a single word, but the deep, silent vibration of his breathing communicated absolutely everything I needed to hear. We were a family, a real, impenetrable family forged in the brutal fires of absolute betrayal and built on a solid foundation of unshakable trust and fierce protective loyalty. Donovan leaned down and gently kissed the top of the baby's head, his large, rough hand gently stroking the soft cotton fabric of the receiving blanket. We turned and walked out of the intensive care unit together, leaving the terrifying shadows and the endless nights of the past 6 months behind us forever. We walked slowly down the long, polished corridors, the soft squeal of our shoes echoing in the quiet morning halls. As we stepped into the main lobby, the heavy automated glass doors slid open, welcoming us back into the living world. We walked out of the sterile hospital and stepped directly into the breathtaking embrace of a warm, golden Atlanta sunrise. The brutal, suffocating rainstorms of the past were completely gone, replaced by a brilliantly clear, endless blue sky. The morning air was crisp and fresh, washing away the harsh chemical smell of the medical ward and filling my lungs with the sweet, intoxicating scent of pure freedom. Donovan gently guided us toward the waiting black-armored SUV parked at the curb, but I paused right at the edge of the sunlit sidewalk. I carefully shifted my sleeping son into my left arm, holding him securely against my beating heart, and reached deep into my jacket pocket with my right hand. I pulled out my sleek black phone, the device that had once been a constant, terrifying leash, tying me to the Vanguard toxicity and endless abuse. I unlocked the bright screen and deliberately opened my digital contact list. I scrolled down to Harrison's name, the man who had traded his own flesh and blood for cheap corporate greed, and I pressed delete. I watched his name vanish from the screen. I scrolled down to Vivian's name, the woman who had stood in the freezing rain, begging for her own comfort while completely ignoring my pain, and I wiped her completely from my digital existence. I erased Carlton. I erased Paige. I deleted every single vile, treacherous, parasitic relative and former associate who had ever tried to make me feel small. With a few simple taps of my thumb, I permanently severed the very last invisible digital chains binding me to that rotting, dead legacy. I slipped the smooth phone back into my pocket, feeling lighter and more powerful than I had ever felt in my entire life. An hour later, we were standing together on the massive wraparound stone balcony of my downtown penthouse. The morning sun was climbing much higher into the clear sky, casting a magnificent glowing golden light over the towering glass and steel skyscrapers of my city. Donovan stood closely beside me, his strong arm resting comfortably around my waist, while our son slept peacefully in my arms, perfectly cradled against my chest. The sprawling city of Atlanta stretched out infinitely below us, a vast glittering kingdom that I had methodically conquered and rightfully claimed as my own. It was perfectly quiet up here, far above the loud noise and the frantic, chaotic traffic of the morning streets. For my entire childhood and adult life, silence had been a terrifying, suffocating punishment, a forced submission to endure the abuse and the cruelty of the Vanguard Empire. But as I looked out over the glittering, endless skyline, feeling the warm, gentle morning breeze brush against my face, I realized that the meaning of the silence had completely changed. It was no longer the silence of a terrified, abused victim cowering in the dark corners of a mansion. It was the deep, absolute, powerful peace of a brilliant queen who had ruthlessly cleansed her empire of all its poison. When they swung that tripod, they thought I would shatter. But they forgot one simple rule of physics. Maximum pressure only creates diamonds, and a diamond will cut through anything. True strength does not come from the people who share your blood, but from the resilience you build when you finally stop trying to earn their toxic love. Sometimes the only way to heal from deep family trauma is to completely sever the heavy chains that bind you to it. You are never obligated to save the people who actively tried to destroy your spirit. True power is taking the exact stones they threw at you and using them to build your own untouchable empire. Please share your own story in the comments below if you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to find your peace, and subscribe for more stories of ultimate survival and absolute justice.